Dixie Fire is now the second largest wildfire in California history. It's burned more than 600 structures, displaced 30,000 people, and still threatens some 13,000 homes.
Deadly heat waves, wildfires destroying US towns and Greek and Siberian forests, Greenland's melting ice sheet, Germany's devastating floods.
And where there isn't fire, there's water. Once in a century, flash floods killed hundreds in Germany, Belgium, and China this summer. The climate is getting more hostile, and today the UN said it is already too late to stop some of the devastating impacts of climate change.
So we've known for decades that the world is warming, but this report tells us that recent changes in the climate are widespread, rapid, and intensifying.
It is indisputable that human activities are causing climate change.
You know, the rich countries agreed more than 10 years ago to put a pot of money together to help developing countries deal with climate change. 10 years later, they have still not got that money together. The trust from the developing countries in the rich world is collapsing as a result of that. When governments know the crisis that we're facing, why are they not acting?
1.1 degree warming already recorded has been enough to unleash catastrophic heat waves, floods, hurricanes and fires across the globe. The world is dangerously close to runaway global warming, and it's unequivocally caused by humans.
Unprecedented in thousands of years. For example, this report tells us that each of the past 4 decades has been the warmest on record since pre-industrial times. Further, it is indisputable that human activities are causing climate change. Human influence is making extreme climate events, including heat waves, heavy rainfall, and droughts, more frequent and severe. What's new in this report is that we can now attribute many more changes at the global and regional level to human influence. But the bottom line is that unless there are immediate, rapid, and large-scale reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, limiting warming to 1.5 degrees C, or 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit, will be beyond reach. The report shows that in the next 20 years, global average temperature is expected to reach or exceed 1.5 degrees C above pre-industrial levels.
The world is literally ending, and I still have to go to work. No, but seriously though, it's getting ridiculous. We are literally working and living through the end of times. Every day we're just like forced to watch the news, watch which wildfire or which catastrophe has hit which side of the globe, and just ignore it and move on. Like, how have we gotten to this point? I mean, I know how we've gotten to this point. Negligence of governments, corporations being greedy and prioritizing profits above all else. But still, it just feels like, how can this many competent adults and policymakers allow us to literally be facing extinction? Sometimes it just doesn't even feel real. Because, I'll go to work and everyone's acting normal and, society will continue chugging on and the capitalist machine will continue chugging on. And then I turn on the news and it's like, oh, by the way, this earth has an expiration date of less than a century. Now, bear with me for a moment because it feels like I'm ranting, but listen to what this guy has to say. He explains it a lot better than I do, but, we should literally be in panic mode. Listen.
But there are cases that are worse than 4.3 degrees. There are what are called feedback loops in the climate system that could conceivably accelerate warming beyond what human action does. So there's what's called the albedo effect, which is a little complicated to explain, but sunlight is reflected back into outer space by any surface that's white. That's why when you wear a white shirt, you're cooler than if you wear a black shirt in the sun in the summer. The less Arctic ice there is, the less reflective white ice there is at the top of the planet. That means more sunlight is being absorbed, which means that more warming would take place. So as Arctic ice melts, the planet's ability to reflect solar energy back into space would diminish and warming would accelerate. There is frozen in the Arctic permafrost a lot of methane, or a lot of carbon, which could be released into the atmosphere as methane if that permafrost melts. Methane is, depending on how you count, at least 30 and perhaps 80 times as powerful a greenhouse gas as carbon dioxide. And there is enough carbon in that permafrost to double the concentration of carbon in the atmosphere that we have today. If that were released, it could accelerate warming by a couple of degrees all on its own. There are many more feedback loops like this. Just this past week, there was a study about cloud formation. If we get to about 1,200 parts per million of carbon, which is much higher than we are today at about 410, but is conceivable early next century, we would completely disrupt the planet's system for cloud formation. And that impact alone, scientists say in this study, would add 8 degrees Celsius of warming to the system. So we'd probably be at already 4.5 or 5 degrees by then, and we could immediately be brought to 12.5 or 13 degrees Celsius. And that really would make much of the planet literally uninhabitable. Not just the equatorial band, not just the tropics, but there would be places in the mid-latitudes that would just be too hot to live. And we have not really begun to think about those possibilities. This is the world that we're entering into now at just 1.1 degrees, but the whole range of possibilities stretches before us. And even the quite optimistic outcomes are horrifying. 2 degrees is genocide, the island nations of the world say.
Like, what? Are we serious? This is literally insane. Like, extinction. And nobody is doing anything. And I have to be optimistic that we're gonna just figure it out. Like, what? Is anybody else going through what I'm going through? Because I'm only 20 years old. What am I gonna do? I'm gonna be 30 fighting for my life. Fighting people in grocery stores for cans of soup. Like, y'all don't understand, like, the climate apocalypse is locked in for the future. And that is what I wanted to talk about. The climate apocalypse. The climate apocalypse is unequivocally locked in for the future. And that's what I wanted my video to be about. I want to talk about contingency plans. I want to talk about what we should be doing once weather gets so extreme that our infrastructure and our governments can no longer help us, because that's just inevitable. The number one thing that is going to help us survive as a species is community, coming together, working together. That's the only way we're going to survive. There's no way to self-reliance yourself out of a hurricane, a Category 5 hurricane. Like, the only way to survive is if we come together as community, is if we open our borders for the equatorial, global south, because it's going to become uninhabitable pretty soon in our lifetimes. We need to have a humanity, global attitude of, kumbaya and, coming together, because if we don't, we will be witnessing and allowing some of the worst human suffering we've ever seen in all of human history to occur as the climate apocalypse begins. And it does not make any sense for us to close our borders, to ignore this, and just self-reliance or whatever, and not listen to what people are saying, because you will die. You will die if you do not work as a community. You all will die. Community is the only way to survive the climate apocalypse. It is the only way. You need people to help you rebuild. You need people to help you protect yourself. You need people to help you grow food. All of the blatant devastation, you're gonna need help, rebuilding and taking care of all that. The only way to survive is community. And I keep repeating that, but it needs to be drilled in your heads. That is the first thing we should be doing as leftists, as people who are concerned about the climate, is advocating for coming together, talking about this apocalyptic future and what it could look like, scaring people, because it's no longer, optimistic. Oh, we'll figure this out. Oh, no. We're at a point where we've basically just lost all control. Just lost all control.